How European basketball players make it to the NBA. Let's play full court, baby. Your go-to channel for the most interesting basketball topics. The Eurostep is nice and all, but the sneaky side-to-side move that has become part of every slasher's arsenal hardly represents the extent of European influence on the NBA game. Over the past 3 decades, and especially since the millennium, European basketball has been behind massive changes in the NBA's style, scouting, and structure. The stereotypical assessment of European basketball is at least partially true. Watch any game that involves FC Barcelona Regal in Spain or Maccabi Tel Aviv in Israel, and you'll immediately note the way the ball zips around the perimeter, rarely stopping and always in search of the open man. It's not totally accurate to call the European style unselfish, largely because the pervasive goal among players is a somewhat selfish desire to win. The key distinction, though, is that European players are developed in a basketball environment that teaches a valuable truth. It's a lot easier to win when 5 guys work together than it is for one star to do the job alone. By and large, players at all 5 positions possess at least a few guard skills that help perpetuate that style. Thanks to past European greats like Arvydas Sabonis, the NBA has seen players such as Marc Gasol and Dirk Nowitzki, big men, who came up in a basketball culture that emphasized passing, shooting, and finesse, regardless of size. Put simply, the European game has style. And with ever-increasing numbers of foreign players making their way to the NBA, that style has become a welcome addition to a league that still suffers from a bogged-down pace and isolation-heavy sets. Signs of change are everywhere, though. Take Manu Ginobili, an Argentine who cut his teeth in the Italian league from 1998 to 2002 before joining the San Antonio Spurs. His creative attacks and unorthodox angles are clear products of the free-flowing European game. Without Ginobili to provide a blueprint, what would James Harden's game look like today? I'd venture to say the beard wouldn't be nearly as effective or exciting if he hadn't ever seen Ginobili play.
He's licking his chops. He fell down.
European basketball has contributed much more than aesthetic style, though. More importantly, its team-first culture has helped offset AAU basketball's disastrous effects on the NBA. The Spurs are at the tip of the spear when it comes to scouting and signing European talent, and that has everything to do with the quality of character they find in players from overseas. Thanks to the predatory me-first environment of American amateur leagues, young domestic products that come up through the AAU ranks are falling behind international imports. This is what Spurs head coach Greg Popovich had to say about the difference between European and American prospects. The traits he scouts for? Players with character, who have gotten over themselves, who understand team play, who can cheer for a teammate, who don't make excuses, hold true regardless of nationality. And when Pop looks at American talent, he sees many players who have been coddled since 8th, 9th, 10th grade by various factions or groups of people. But the foreign kids don't live with that, so they don't feel entitled, he says, noting how many clubs work on fundamentals in 2-a-day practices, each lasting up to 3 hours. Now, you can't paint it with too wide a brush, but in general, that's a fact. It wasn't so long ago that teams could get by without spending much time on international scouting, but that's certainly not the case now. European talent is a highly valued commodity these days, and not just because of the reasons we've already mentioned. From a financial perspective, it makes a ton of sense to isolate a potential gem, draft him, and then stash him overseas while he rounds out his game on another team. Once the player gets enough seasoning, and his team is ready to let him out of his contract, the NBA squad that drafted him can exercise its rights and haul in a finished product. San Antonio drafted Thiago Splitter, a native of Brazil, in 2007, but he continued to play for the Spanish team that had signed him as a 15-year-old prospect until 2010. Splitter developed on Baskonia's dime, while the Spurs got to focus on the progress of the players on their own roster. When the time was right, Splitter hopped a plane to San Antonio. It's somewhat risky to use draft picks on European players for a couple of reasons. It was theoretically possible that Splitter, for example, might never have been able to get out of his contract. Plus, high-profile lottery busts like Nicholas Skitishvili, number 5 overall in 2002, and Darko Milicic, number 2 overall in 2003, may have scared a few teams away from taking the Euro plunge. Nonetheless, because of the relative value European draftees represent, not to mention all of the positives Popovich outlined above, every NBA team now has to spend a large portion of its resources on international scouting. In a surprisingly short amount of time, the NBA has become a league where teams that don't focus on Europe are putting themselves behind the curve, and this isn't some passing fad either. With basketball's popularity growing unchecked throughout the world, it'll only become more important for NBA teams to have eyes overseas. And all this raises the question, how do the top European players make it to the NBA? Well, some of the players have contracts which allow them to switch to an NBA side for free if they offer them a contract. This is for sure not the case with every European player. Most of the young guys enter the NBA draft. Players like Luka Doncic, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Dario Saric, Giannis Antetokounmpo all came in the league through the draft and had pretty successful careers. 5 players left Europe during the 2020-21 season and ended up signing in the NBA. Facundo Campazzo, Gabriel Deck, Mike James, Luke Vildoza, and Elijah Bryant started the season playing in EuroLeague. However, they are ending it as NBA players. While this is clearly a new trend that may continue in the coming years, those 5 cases, with the exception of the transfers of Deck and Vildoza, are totally different and have only one key connection: the financial resources of the NBA franchises that eclipse those of Europe. A clear result of the COVID pandemic was how the transfer of Facundo Campazzo was completed. It was the worst kept secret in European basketball that Campazzo had decided to continue his career in the NBA, and before ending up in Denver, he was linked for a long time with Minnesota. The connection with the Timberwolves is quite obvious since Argentinian legend Pablo Prigioni is currently an assistant with the Wolves. Real Madrid also knew that and was ready to part ways with the player, getting a monster like €6 million buyout. That number is an unprecedented milestone and practically more than the annual budget of a mid-tier European club. There was no similar deal in the past, and it's hard to imagine that more than a handful of players who are currently signed in Europe have a similar buyout clause on their contracts. With the Denver Nuggets being able to offer just $750,000, according to the CBA, it was up to the Spanish agent of Campazzo and Octagon Europe senior director David Caro, together with the Argentinian agent Claudio Villanova, to negotiate the terms of the buyout payment. The deal of Campazzo was considered almost an impossible deal from all the people around him because of the €6 million buyout, Caro explains to Eurohoops. That's the biggest buyout clause in the history of European basketball. But we are here to do the impossible, he adds with a smile. With the pandemic delaying the NBA free agency after the start of the EuroLeague season, Campazzo ultimately left Real Madrid in November, having played during the first 2 months of the season in Spain and using his salaries as part of the buyout, while staying in top shape, ready to make the NBA jump. It's obvious that all this wouldn't have happened if the NBA start of the season was not delayed due to COVID, and that makes the Campazzo deal one of a kind and one of the most difficult to navigate operations ever in getting a player from Europe to the NBA. The decision of CSKA Moscow to let Mike James play for the Nets was practically a happy accident for the player and the Russian club. With James being suspended by CSKA's coach Dimitris Satoudis while having 2 seasons left on his contract with the Army team, James got the permission to find an NBA deal. The Nets' deal was a gift from the heavens for all sides involved. James is getting the chance to showcase his talent as a member of elite NBA contenders that need guards, and CSKA, on the other hand, is willing to let James continue his career in the NBA and not end up signing with a European rival, while negotiating with him in the upcoming summer his release and saving some, if not all, the money from the rest of his deal, which includes $5 million in salaries until the summer of 2023. This were some of the most recent Europe to NBA transfers which ended up being successful. It is very likely that there are many more to come, with the NBA adapting more and more European basketball style of play. We hope you enjoyed the video topic today. Subscribe to our channel, Full Court, for more interesting basketball topics.